Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News. Several chiefs from northern BC came together in Prince George to show support for vulnerable populations. Leaders spoke about the opioid crisis and the lack of affordable housing in the province. APTN's Lee Wilson reports.
The Healing Fire Coalition gathered at a homeless encampment in Prince George called Moccasin Flats. Central and Northern BC chiefs, along with organizations, came to show support for the unhoused in the city. Many are members of their communities. Clayton Tenay Chief Darlene Logan says they wanted everybody there to know they care.
Members here can see that they're being noticed and that we care about them. That's the main thing, was that we care. We're not shutting the door in their faces. We're not saying, make an appointment to come see me. Like, it's just come see us. We'll try and do the best we can, and this is just the start of it.
Prince George Mayor Simon Yu says he ran his campaign to help find a solution, and he vowed to find answers.
I will do my best to help, to coordinate, to do whatever necessary to address the problem we're facing here today.
Homelessness and housing isn't just a problem in Prince George. It exists all over the country. This week, in an online press conference, a national group of Indigenous housing providers raised the alarm for the dire need for Indigenous housing. They're calling for the federal government to provide $6 billion per year to deal with housing.
But the government must make immediate, meaningful, and sustained investments to stave off the ongoing crisis that not only are we all aware of and experiencing, but has most particularly exacerbated the housing and health crisis for Indigenous peoples.
Back in Prince George at the homeless camp, the Healing Fire Coalition held a ceremony for another big problem: addiction. Late last month, the BC Coroner Service released a report on the toxic drug supply deaths in the province. It said that in 2022, there were 2,272 suspected illicit drug toxicity deaths. Chesletta Carrier Nation Chief Corona Lewin expressed the need for a healing and treatment center in the north, like the one proposed for Tatchet Lake near Vanderhoof.
We need for a caring shelter to fit the needs of this population, and it must be a priority.
The coalition holds fire ceremonies every week in Sycus territory. The gatherings are to support those dealing with addictions and families that lost members to the opioid crisis. Chief Priscilla Mueller believes community leaders and organizations can come together to find long-term solutions.
Can't just depend on the province and the government to do things for us. I think our communities, if we could come together, we could find a solution on how could we help, with homelessness.
Lee Wilson, APTN National News, Prince George.
The lack of housing is a pressing issue in Whitehorse too, but a former hotel will soon be opening its doors to vulnerable people in need in that city. 20 rooms at the former Coast High Country Inn are being converted into temporary housing units. Last year, the nonprofit Safe at Home Society received federal and territorial funding to buy and renovate the building. Safe at Home plans to eventually operate the building as permanent housing with 67 units. Executive Director Kate Meechan says the hope is for 75% of leaseholders to be Indigenous.
Any relief that we can provide in a housing market such as this, where there's no access to deeply affordable housing for people, the benefit of this particular project, although temporary, is that there will be supports on site.
Still in the Yukon, RCMP are asking witnesses to come forward in the homicide of an Indigenous man that took place in Whitehorse last week. 35-year-old Aaron Smarch of Carcross has been identified as the victim. Smarch was found lying on the ground during the early hours of February 2nd in the vicinity of 4th Avenue and Ogilvie Street. He was transported to hospital and later pronounced deceased. A makeshift memorial on 4th Avenue has been erected in his honor. RCMP are asking anyone who may have had contact with or saw Aaron's march after 1 a.m. on February 2nd to come forward. A criminal justice centre has opened in Kenora, Ontario. It's designed to help Indigenous people end cycles of incarceration by connecting offenders to cultural resources and still holding them accountable. Healthcare, education, housing, and social services will all be a part of the centre, which will be owned by the Kenora Chiefs. Anishinaabe Nation Grand Chief Derek Fox says his own loss of language and culture made him angry as a teenager. He got himself into trouble, but he had hockey and books to fall back on. He says today, young people need help.
Nan has 49 First Nations, 50,000 people. 90% of our population is under the age of 18. There's drug abuse, alcohol abuse. There's all kinds of issues affecting our First Nations. There's no infrastructure. There's no minor hockey. There's no movie theater. There's social problems. They come out of our communities, they go to school.
Healthcare meetings between the Prime Minister, premiers and territorial leaders wrapped up in Ottawa earlier today. Ottawa announced it will increase health funding to the provinces and territories by $196 billion over 10 years. This includes $2 billion targeted towards Indigenous health priorities. But First Nations leaders have expressed frustration at not being invited to the bilateral talks. At a press conference Tuesday morning, Grand Chief Alison Linklater, who speaks for the Mushkegowuk Council in Northern Ontario.
You know, not being at these meetings and not having our voice heard in regards to healthcare is very disappointing. They don't know what we live. They don't know what we go through to access healthcare. Even in our remote communities, you know, how can they say they can advocate for us and say what's best for us? Is totally way off base.
The country's premiers held a press conference late this afternoon. APTN News asked them if the $2 billion commitment to Indigenous health was enough. Here's what some of them had to say.
It's never enough. We are asking for something from the federal government, and so we'll see. Again, we just received this. You know, again, they've had our proposal for 2.5 years, and we've had it for two and a half hours. So we're going to have, you know, really see what the details mean.
So my concern, and I brought it to the Prime Minister and the ministers, is that it can't only be on reserves. In the Northwest Territories and much of the North, we don't have the reserves that you do in the South. So it has to make sure that the Indigenous stream addresses all Indigenous people within Canada.
I think that especially when we're looking at culturally appropriate programming for mental health and addiction, for long-term care support, as well as for health facilities on reserve, those are all a priority in Alberta, and so I'll do more consultation with the chiefs when we return, but I think that this recognition that there needed to be a special line item was a very important measure.
A crisis continues at the Assembly of First Nations. That's according to professor and columnist Gino Sinclair. We'll discuss the recent resignation of the AFN CEO after the break. Welcome back. The Assembly of First Nations continues its silence on the resignation of Chief Executive Officer Janice Cavalia, leaving the organization embroiled in internal investigations. For more, we're joined by Professor Gino Sinclair, a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Gino, thanks for being with us. What do you make of the Chief Executive Officer of the Assembly of First Nations resigning?
Well, it's clear that there's anyone who thinks the crisis is ended, it continues to perpetuate itself. We've now got 5 human rights complaints when it comes to the National Chief. And there's a real divide between the political wing, which is the AFN National Chief's Office and the regional chiefs, and then the Secretariat, which is the more business side, the everyday side of the AFN. And that's really led to a major constitutional crisis within the organization.
Some grassroots people, and I saw this on my Twitter feed as well, that they seem surprised that the AFN even had a CEO. Can you talk about the role and whether it's significant to lose the CEO?
To get into this is a bit of a history lesson, so I'll be as brief as I can. When the AFN was set up under the National Indian Brotherhood back in the days of the White Paper in 1969, it was mostly a political organization. It was intended for lobbying First Nations to come together to rally to challenge the White Paper, which at that time was the erasure of treaties and the radical redevelopment of our relationship with the federal government. In fact, the erasure of our relationship in many different ways. So that political work really resulted in a lot of momentum against the federal government. What Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, did back in those days is offer to turn the AFN, National Indian Brotherhood at that time, into a program delivery organization. Basically say, well, you tell us what we should do then. And that's happened for now 5 decades. The AFN has been a program delivery operation, meaning millions of dollars is funneled through the AFN. And what that means is that you need a body to administer that. That's where the Secretariat comes in, or what's been called the National Indian Brotherhood, Inc. And they operate the program delivery models, the consultation groups, the studies, even, and cards on the table. I've written a curriculum for the AFN that was under the Secretariat. Now, the political wing, of course, is what we see more publicly. That's the chiefs that are voted in. Now, the problem is that under the constitution of the AFN, these are supposed to work in concert, but the problem is that the national chief has said that the Secretariat needs a major revamping, a reorganization, and in an interview with me recently said that the Secretariat needs to be turned into more of a combination with the political wing so that the organization can be sovereign and different, autonomous to the federal government. Because right now, when you're dependent on program dollars to run your organization, you tend to be more favorable to the federal government than less favorable.
Super important and quick history lesson there. Appreciate that. Those like yourself and I who do pay quite a bit of attention to the AFN have been talking about these types of things, but the AFN itself is not. Is there a bit of a communications problem here?
Well, it's a legal problem, really. In my interview with Roseanne Archibald recently, National Chief Archibald said that she can't talk about any of these issues because they're before the courts. But the problem is that if you don't talk, then everybody else will talk. Mm-hmm. And so what you're seeing is a lot of rumors and innuendo on what the issues are. Here's the fact. The fact is that you have a national chief who is having a human resources crisis with the upper management of the more administrative wing of the organization. At the same time, you have forces within the political wing, the regional chiefs in particular, and the regional chiefs really don't represent a whole lot of people. Oftentimes they're voted in by a dozen, 20 or so chiefs within their provincial organizations, and they're working with some of those individuals who have been cast off from the Secretariat employees who have been creating momentum against the national chief. Say what you will about the national chief. She was voted in democratically. You either believe in democracy or not, and as we saw with the United States, even voting in Donald Trump, you didn't see people who were saying, oh, well, we throw out the results of the election. What people said was, we just got to deal with the person in charge, and whether she wants to analyze the financial irregularities of the organization, do a human resource assessment, even if she wants to take a look at the Secretariat and completely change how the AFN does its business, she is the national chief. And so having these forces within the political and the administrative wing of the organization really leads to a crisis, but it's a rather self-imposed crisis, and that really is what people are talking about today. An organization in chaos is what the headlines most often read.
Super quick, Nigan, while we have you here, premiers are meeting with the federal government, talking about health care spending, among other things. First Nations have been left out. What's being left out here?
Well, there's many days where, as an Indigenous person, your head kind of explodes the way that Canada operates without First Nations leaving us out of the room. But these premier meetings, these First Minister meetings, are really a disgraceful moment when you don't have First Nations. I mean, healthcare alone. Who handled the pandemic better than almost anyone? It was First Nations across country who were willing to give up even their basic human rights to agree to curfews, to agree to really radical decisions made in communities, to protect other communities by holding volunteer checkpoints on highways. The fact is that First Nations know perhaps more than health than anyone in this country, and yet they're cut out of these negotiations. There's also some very disturbing discussions happening around the issue of resources and the fact that the federal government wants to deal with the United States in their race to try to come out of the pandemic and deal with inflation. Canada's solution to that is to deal with and to try to extract more resources, encourage businesses on First Nations, and there's First Ministers discussions happening at those healthcare meetings talking about resource and, of course, using terms like red tape when they're discussing Indigenous rights. Our rights are never red tape. Our rights are constitutional.
Always great to speak with you, Nigan. Thanks for taking some time.
Yeah, Miigwech, thanks so much.
A celebration of life was held over the weekend for Gino Odjick. We'll take you to the event after the break. Welcome back. Time now to take a look at our photo of the day. Fawn Jack sent us this up-close look at some early morning frost along the ground. Keep your pics coming. You can send them to share@aptn.ca. Now let's take a look at Wednesday's weather forecast. Starting on the East Coast, +3 with snow in Halifax, 0 with snow for Charlottetown. -21 in Kuujjuaq, snow and 8 below for Nain. +1 and cloudy in Montreal, 11 below for Chibougamau. +3 in Sault Ste. Marie, 1 below in North Bay. +1 in Thunder Bay, 0 for Sioux Lookout. -18 with snow in Churchill, 5 below in God's Lake. 0 with snow for Winnipeg and Dauphin. -1 and snow in Regina, flurries and 2 below in North Battleford. -5 in Meadow Lake, sunny and 4 below in La Ronge. In northern Alberta, sunny and -15 for Fort Chip, 2 below under the sun in Fort McMurray. +2 with snow in Edmonton, +3 with snow for Lethbridge. 6 in Vancouver, 8 is the high for Victoria. +2 and snow in Prince George, 0 with snow in Smithers. -27 in Old Crow, 8 below and snow in Whitehorse. -18 in Yellowknife, 26 below for Norman Wells. -29 with snow in Sax Harbor, 26 below in Pawlatuck. 33 below in Chesterfield, -38 with snow in Cambridge Bay. -35 in Resolute and Igloolik. In Vancouver, former teammates, friends, family, and leaders gathered over the weekend to celebrate the life of the late Gino Odjick. APTN's Tina House was there and has this story.
It was an all-star event, as many members of the Canucks alumni stood with members of Gino's family at a celebration of life for the hockey star. His best friend Peter Leach and his wife Shar took care of Gino for 10 years and says it was an honor to do so.
You know, he was a true warrior. You know, he didn't see himself as a legend. He goes, I haven't earned that yet. He said, I'm not there like Brian Trottier, you know. But I said, no, man, today he's a true legend, without a doubt, you know, and I'm honored to say that.
Former teammate Jeff Courtnall says Gino was more than a teammate.
Gino was a leader on that team, and he did it in probably the greatest ways, and that was, you know, not only in the room being such a fun, positive guy, but on the ice. Probably, you know, the greatest protector that I played with, and he knew how to do his job better than anybody.
And here on the Musqueam Reserve, we truly celebrate a man that meant so much to so many, and Musqueam was considered his second home.
It's such a privilege and honor to stand in front of each and every one of you, not as elected chief of Musqueam, as a friend, as a brother. Like I said, when he first came into our community, he was a friend, and when he left, he was our brother.
Stan Smill, another former teammate, says his legacy will be remembered.
Just an honest, humble, regular guy that made it to the NHL, and he stayed that way throughout his whole career and after his career.
Two of Gino's sons, Tobias and Bure, who is named after Gino's best friend Pavel Bure, say they are so proud of their dad and his legacy.
He lived out every hockey player's dream, but not only doing that alone, he did it as an Indigenous hockey player, and it gives everyone hope. And he said it himself, if a little res boy can do it, from the little kid from the res can do it, anyone can. And that's something I think everyone should live by. It truly means everything to us to have him in our life, and for as long as we did. So,
country star Aaron Pritchett honored Gino with a song to memorialize a man that came from humble beginnings and rose to be one of the first Indigenous and greatest hockey players in the NHL, meanwhile paving a way for others to follow.
Looking back on the memory of the dance we shared beneath the stars above. For a moment, all the world was right. How could I have known that you'd ever say goodbye?
He loved the city of Vancouver. He loved his home kidding on ZB, and we're gonna miss him very deeply. But he's always gonna be in our hearts and our souls, and that number 29 forever.
Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
Beautiful looking ceremony there. Well, award-winning singer-songwriter Christy Lane Sinclair is our guest on a new episode of Face to Face tonight. Sinclair is back with her first new music in years, with a new single she calls Hyper Personal. It's her account of living with domestic violence and post-traumatic stress disorder.
It came after domestic abuse. I had PTSD, and basically I had 2 broken hands. So I wrote this kind of teaching myself to play guitar again, and just processing and trying to make an accurate description of, that event. So for me, it's just like total therapy.
And you can watch our entire interview with award-winning singer-songwriter Christy Lane Sinclair right here, coming up in just a few minutes' time. And don't forget to join us live tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern Time for In Focus. Daryl will be speaking with leadership from First Nations, where suspected unmarked graves have recently been discovered. Of course, for more on anything you've seen here, you can head on over to our website. That's aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for being with us. Stick around. Face to Face is next. Have a great night.